So, despite internationally accepted close links between the terrorist groups, the Taliban and the Haqqani Network, the US State Department said that they are two separate entities. On Friday, at the daily State Department press briefing in Washington, when asked about sharing information regarding the security of the Kabul airport with the Taliban and whether this was then extended to the Haqqani Network, the US State Department spokesperson Ned Price was asked this question and he replied, "The Taliban and the Haqqani Network are two separate entities." The question tonight on Left, Right and Centre, is the Biden administration playing with fire? Joining us on the show, we have Fazal Haqmal, a US Army Afghan war veteran, Harun Najafizada, director of the 24/7 news channel, Afghanistan International TV. We have retired Lieutenant General KJ Singh, former General Officer, Commander-in-Chief of the Western Command, Professor Scott Lucas, Emeritus Professor of International Politics at the University of Birmingham and the founder of the EA Worldview. And we have Michael Kugelman, Deputy Director and Senior Associate for the South Asia program. Fazal Haqmal, first to you. The Biden administration's approach, really whitewashing the Taliban, calling it a separate entity from the Haqqani Network, it shows the desperation of the US to exit Afghanistan at whatever cost. But Mr. Haqmal, as a US Army Afghan war veteran, the historical irony here must be mind-boggling. This must be especially hard to stomach for veterans like you.
Well, thank you very much. For us, when we were deployed, it is clear that we were fighting ISI. We were in Afghanistan fighting ISI, GQ, ISI, force multipliers, because ISI has a particular doctrine, a doctrine of strategic depth, and that doctrine of strategic depth is they're using a doctrine of strategic depth to achieve what they call a secure strategic rear. And that tells them, and that has been broadly taught throughout the Pakistani military institutions, to have a weak Afghanistan and stable Afghanistan would always provide them that strategic depth. So now when we look at these different organizations, the Taliban, the Haqqani Network, the ISIS, for us, and I'm someone that's been deployed downrange, I've looked at war, I know what a fog of war looks like, I've looked at it from academic perspective. For us, there's no difference. The Taliban, ISIS, Haqqani Network, they're all ideologically aligned. On the top of it, they continue to serve as variable hands of ISI. That's clear evidence there, literature is there. We could play with words, we could identify them, they'll give them different definitions, but that is not going to change their disposition.
So they're ideologically conjoined, says Mr. Haqmal there. Harun Najafizada, almost overnight, you see US forces in Afghanistan going from being mortal enemies of the Taliban to being stuck in this, awkward marriage of convenience against a now mutual enemy. That's the ISIS-K. But the problem here is that this ISIS-K seems to be mounting terrorist attacks against the US-led evacuation efforts on the ground.
That's quite worrying. It's worrying for the Afghan people in particular, because we expected that the war in Afghanistan should come to some sort of an end game. Now that the Americans are leaving, Kabul has fallen down to the hand of the Taliban, and the Taliban is harsh in ensuring security for the people in Afghanistan. Some even went that far to call it the quietness and peace of graveyard. But despite that, we see worrying reports that there is another group from somewhere in the world being ready to mount attack on the Afghan people. You name it, Daesh, IS, ISIS, Khorasan, whatever it is, but this is a lethal threat to the civilians, and that is quite disappointing to see that bloodshed and war, unfortunately, goes on in Afghanistan despite a huge setback to the Afghan nation with the return of the Taliban to the Afghan cities.
Michael Kugelman, you know, the nexus between the Pakistanis and the Haqqani network, that has been indisputable. It perhaps now it's indispensable to a Taliban takeover, but is the Biden administration playing with fire going down this line, or do they have no choice?
Well, I think this is the problem. And I think that the Biden administration is looking at a really difficult decision here that it has to make. It is very intent on ramping up its capacity to continue to carry out counterterrorism activities in Afghanistan after it's left there formally. And it really does not have eyes on the ground, or it will not have eyes on the ground after it's left. The Taliban is really all it has. And certainly, to think of the U.S. partnering with the group that used to murder and terrorize U.S. troops for many years, it seems absurd, for sure. And particularly because we're looking at a situation where you're going to have Haqqani Network leaders that will be in charge of some of the key portfolios. Yes. Meaning, when it comes to terrorism and security, there's indications that a Haqqani leader will be in charge of intelligence operations. We already know that a Haqqani leader will be running security in Kabul. These are the types of individuals that the U.S. would have to work with. Right. These are the types of individuals the U.S. would have to work on counterterrorism. Makes no sense. And the other problem is that I certainly will argue that there's a separation between the Taliban/Haqqani Network and ISIS-K. But you have this long history of disaffected Taliban members shifting allegiances and going to ISIS-K. So there's a very real risk that the U.S. could want to work with Taliban members, Haqqani members of the Taliban, and risk seeing some of these so-called partners with the Taliban jumping ship and moving over to ISIS, which would have major implications to say the least. So yes, I do think this is a case of the U.S. potentially playing with fire, but given that the U.S. has not been able to secure any type of basing arrangements with countries that border Afghanistan, it's in a really tough spot where right now it has to depend only on existing U.S. military facilities in the Gulf to be used as a base for counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan. And that's why it sees the Taliban as a potential advantage, because it is there on the ground and they share a common enemy. But for the reasons I mentioned, I think it's a really dangerous gamble, to put it mildly.
Dangerous and absurd. Professor Scott Lucas, that eventually what this means is that American military leaders may have to collaborate with persons who are part of a network that the U.S. has already designated as global terrorists, with like this Khalil Haqqani, etc. They already have a $5 million U.S. bounty on their heads. This is since 2001.
Yes, I couldn't hear Michael Kugelman, so I hope I don't repeat what he said. But there's a specific calculation here, and then a wider calculation and big question. The specific calculation from the State Department is, look, you know, you've repeated it again and again, that Sirajuddin Haqqani is the deputy leader of the Taliban.
Yes.
When the Taliban had its first talks with ex-President Karzai, Dr. Abdallah, Mr. Hekmatyar, it was Anas Haqqani who welcomed them. So to say they're separate is nonsense, but the Americans have designated Haqqani or Haqqani members as people with bounties on their heads, most wanted. So you can't be seen to cooperate with them. Secondly, and I think this is the wider and important issue, there is already de facto U.S.-Taliban cooperation which has taken place around the Taliban entry into Kabul. Before the Taliban came in, the U.S. had talks with the Taliban which said don't attack the embassies, allow an evacuation zone. We know that the CIA head, William Burns, talked to Taliban leadership, in fact, Mullah Baradar, to try to get an extension of the evacuation. And we know that the day after the Kabul attack, General McKenzie has said this, the head of Central Command, they were in discussions with the Taliban about the security perimeter. Here is the key question. Because Joe Biden has declared a second war on terror with the focus on ISIS-K, and because the U.S. doesn't really have assets inside Afghanistan now, even for drone strikes, do they cooperate with the Taliban in a campaign against ISIS-K, and how far do they go? Do they unfreeze the assets of the central bank? Do they reverse their pressure on the IMF over loans? Do they diplomatic recognition of the Taliban? Where does this stop? The U.S. gave up almost all leverage in Afghanistan with the military withdrawal, and now when you face something like ISIS-K, your leverage potentially has to come from your former enemies, the Taliban, and yes, the Haqqani Network.
An unbelievable catch-22 situation. But Lieutenant General, KJ is saying it's a question of trust. In the middle of all of this also, it's a question of trust. The US has relied upon the Taliban to maintain security checkpoints around Kabul's airport, as Professor Scott says, in order to protect the Americans, to ensure that the evacuations can take off. The Central Command leader, General Frank McKenzie, on Thursday said that the US would continue to ask the Taliban to assist with security, saying that he hadn't seen evidence of the Taliban, that the Taliban knowing of the ISIS-K's attack. But the point, Lieutenant General Singh, would be, if the Taliban was providing security around the airport, how did a suicide bomber get in? Not one, possibly two.
Sarah, the problem is the big narrative that America is trying to build is that Taliban has to be mainstreamed. And to mainstream Taliban, you have to find a new enemy, new villain. And you have now found ISIS-K or ISKP. Now, all these things are just labels. The basic stock is same. After all, what is the difference between Taliban and IS? Taliban talks in terms of an emirate and IS talks in terms of a caliphate. That is the only discerning difference. Now, these people have changed their labels so often. The person who was held accountable for attacks on Gurdwara, the Sheikh Aslam Faruqi, who was released from the prison in Bagram and who's reputed to have played a part in this suicide attack. Now, this person was earlier a LET cadre, and then he broke up with LET and he joined ISK. So it's a great game which is unfolding now. It suits a lot of narratives. America is happy that we have a new enemy and we can focus over there. And on the other side, Taliban is also happy because Taliban is cutting down the exodus of skilled workforce, the people who are required to run Afghanistan. In 20 odd years, people have got trained to run the facilities and services. They all want to run away. So how do you stop it? You have these bomb blasts, convenient things, and then everybody stops and freezes over there. Pakistan is thrilled because Pakistan has got new relevance now. So it's a very dangerous game which America is playing. And through your channel, I want to ask one question. That if you knew that there is somebody who's holed up in Nangarhar province and you could launch the drone attack, why didn't you do it preemptively? Why did you have to wait for this? Why did you have to lose 150 lives? Because the intelligence
the answer is obvious, sir. The US wanted to get its own citizens out, its troops out.
Yeah, Sarah, unfortunately, and that is a very sad and distressing conclusion we have reached. And one is worried if it is going to be an attack and then some intelligence sharing and then another drone attack. Are we going to play this game now? That you have a suicide attack and then Taliban parts with that information which they have, or ISI parts with that information, and a demonstrated drone attack is carried out, and for 3-4 months the temperature and hype is brought down and some lives are lost. So it's a very dangerous game, and unfortunately we are being made to believe that labels are important, whereas label is not important. It is the idea which is important. We have to get at the idea. We have to lay down the red lines. And we really have to know who is in control. A couple of weeks back, we were told Turkish defense forces will guard this airport. And then we were told, and why was Bagram vacated in the first place? That was an ideal place to evacuate people. So all this is a very strange kind of operational planning. As an armed forces person, I am very worried at the kind of strategic culture which has been displayed on ground. And I can only hope and pray that the cutting-edge cadre displays some maturity. See, after all, Taliban is operating at 3 levels. At level 1 is a person like Sirajuddin, Haqqani and all this who come to press conferences. They know the right language. They are politically educated people. They make the right noises and vibes. and they want to find acceptability. Level 2 is commander. But level 3 is the people who are dealing with citizens. They are the guys who killed Danish Siddiqui. They were told he's a journalist, yet he was killed. So unfortunately, we are in for difficult times unless America changes its tack and brings in red lines and reads the right act both to ISI and Taliban.
Professor Scott Lucas, I want to give you the last word on this. It may not really matter for the US president to find out what the umbilical relations or the cord is between the Haqqani network and the Taliban, as long as they have exited Kabul. But there are going to be serious repercussions of this that we're going to see, especially in this part of the world where we live in this neighborhood. And this is going to be a catastrophe for democracy and human rights, because the fact is all of these terror groups are united by the fact that their sole target is a democratic world.
Well, I think we have to be careful as analysts about moving away from the facts and getting into conspiracy theories. The fact
How do you mean?
is that the Taliban is a rival of ISIS-K, and ISIS-K is a rival of the Taliban.
But ideologically, their ideology...
Ideologically, ISIS-K is criticizing the Taliban for being too weak in its approach, both on implementation within Afghanistan and on talking to Western countries. Plus, it's a simple question of power. They want power. They don't want the Taliban to necessarily have it. So the attack at Kabul airport was to attack the U.S. and to make the Taliban look weak. Now, why do I say that? Is it to make the Taliban look good and ISIS-K bad? Absolutely not. But as an analyst, there are two things that come from this. You have to be clear-eyed that the Americans do not see, they didn't welcome the attack. They don't think it was good.
Of course.
They're horrified by it. Because of their focus on ISIS-K, however, the enemy of my enemy, the Taliban, might become convenient. And secondly, you have to look then at Pakistan's role. You will not be able to sanction Pakistan. The international community won't sanction Pakistan. They won't make them the bad guys, because Pakistan right now is in a position as a broker on what happens in Afghanistan. So how do you approach Afghanistan to not only move against ISIS-K, which is what the Americans want, but to put some kind of pressure on the Taliban?
Correct. Very difficult questions. No easy answers for them, and this is not the last we've heard on this story. But thank you all for your time, for your opinion, for your expertise. Thank you again, and thank you all for joining us on Left, Right and Center.